Today we're going to go over the first 3 steps to effectively and safely build a fat loss nutrition plan for basketball players. I've made a muscle building nutrition plan series on the channel. By the way, if you haven't seen that, definitely check that out after you're done here. But I haven't quite gone in depth on the process of putting together a fat loss nutrition plan for basketball players. And this is something so many players mess up and do the wrong way in a way that actually ends up hurting their performance. So I want to make this 2-video series, this is part 1, to actually clarify that and make sure you're going in the right direction and doing everything the right way so you can actually lose fat in a way that helps your performance in the long run. Now, why would you even want to lose fat in the first place as a basketball player? Especially if you've been following my content, you understand that going into a deficit is not really ideal for performance. So in what situation would you actually want to pursue that fat loss as a way to inherently improve performance? Well, if you're very overweight or holding on to a lot of extra body fat, not just like a little bit, everyone's gonna have some body fat. You don't have to be absolutely shredded. In fact, you probably shouldn't be absolutely shredded as a basketball player. But if you're holding on to a lot of extra body fat, like about 15, 16, 17, 20+% body fat, in that case, you'll probably benefit from cutting down in a safe way. Because when you look at body fat, there really is no benefit to having excess amounts. Of course, you need a basic amount to survive, for organ function, for stuff like that. But above 8 to 12%, that's kind of the sweet spot. Anywhere below 15%, really, if you're a teenager especially who's below 15%, I wouldn't make it a point to go out of your way to go into a deficit, especially as you're growing. But if you're holding on to more than that, it's not really gonna benefit your performance, and you would likely benefit from cutting down a little bit. Now, the most important part here before we get underway with any of this is what time of the year are you in right now? If you're watching this right now as it's coming out, you're most likely in your off season, which is a prime time to actually go after some fat loss because you don't have those performance demands. But if you are in season right now and you have games and you're watching this maybe a few months after it's released or years after it's released, the same thing still holds up. If you're in season or if you have high performance demands, maybe even in the off season, if you're going to a recruiting camp or an AAU tournament or something like that where you need to perform at a high level to get recognized by college coaches, or maybe you're a pro player going to a combine or something of that nature, I wouldn't recommend going into a fat loss phase because, as we'll get into in a minute, your calorie intake isn't going to quite match up with your performance needs, and it's going to hurt you in the short term. This brings us into the first thing you need to understand. The first step is crafting a very clear and intentional vision around this entire process. Again, if you're in season or if you have high performance demands, now most likely is not the time to go after fat loss. And you got to be honest with yourself. Are you willing to accept a short-term decrease in performance? Because the nutrition plan that's going to be required to achieve fat loss is actually contradictory to the nutrition plan that would elicit maximum performance. So in certain cases, again, if you're holding on to excess body fat, that short-term sacrifice will actually be beneficial in the long term. But if you're already in a situation where you're healthy, you're relatively lean, and you don't really need to lose that little bit of body fat, that little stubborn belly fat you have left, that's the phrase I can't stand. I hear it so many times in the questions that get asked to me. If you're dealing with that, you likely aren't gonna benefit from that short-term sacrifice long-term, and you'd be better off just focusing on performance or muscle gain or something like that. And once you're clear on that, then we can transition into that next step. And the next step is simply setting a foundation of helpful habits that are going to serve you well through the fat loss process. Of course, eventually we want to get you tracking your food intake, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. But before we do that, in order for you to effectively track your food intake in a way that actually helps you out and doesn't just confuse and overwhelm you, you need to have a foundation of some basic habits. And this is something a lot of people skip over, and they go right into tracking their macros and getting super exact with it, and it's overwhelming, it confuses them, and they don't actually end up sticking to their nutrition plan. And as you know, when you don't stick to a nutrition plan, you don't get results. So an easy way to avoid that situation is take a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. You can even take a couple of months with this if you really need to set that foundation of some very basic habits that will put you in a good position going forward. This includes things like getting a consistent meal schedule, and so 3 to 5 meals per day, consistently sticking to that, following a consistent meal structure, making sure you're getting your protein, carbohydrates, and color at every single meal, making sure you're staying hydrated, setting your hydration goal. I have videos on all 3 of those topics on the channel, so check those out. Make sure you have that stuff dialed in. Again, this could take you as short as a couple of days for some players who are really dialed in, or it might even take you a couple of months. There's no right or wrong answer here. You just got to have that foundation in place, because without that foundation, you get into the more advanced stuff and you're going to get confused real quick, fall off real quick and end up right back at square one wondering, why does nutrition not work for you? It didn't work for you because you didn't have the foundation going into it. And then before we get into the third step, as always, if you enjoyed this video, you're getting value out of it so far, I'd really appreciate it if you drop a like on it and subscribe if you're new around here for new videos just like this every single Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. And part 2 of this series will be dropping on Thursday, so make sure you hit that subscribe button down below. Now, the third step that we're gonna go over in this video is beginning to actually track your food intake. So once you have a clear idea of your vision and understand what comes along with that, you have that foundation in place of those basic habits that are gonna set you up for success going forward. Now we can actually get into tracking your food. And this might kind of throw you for a curveball a little bit, but you're not gonna actually hit any targets right off the bat when you start tracking. I don't care what your calorie goal is, I don't care what your macro goal is, I just simply want you to track your food intake without changing anything. Don't try to eat more, don't try to eat less, don't try to eat healthier. Just stick to whatever meals you've been eating leading up to this point, because that gives us our baseline and it creates awareness around your food intake. And without awareness qualitatively in terms of, oh, that doesn't look so good, or oh, that looks really good, and quantitatively in terms of the numbers of how many calories you're eating, what your macros are at, without that awareness, we cannot effectively build you a nutrition plan going forward. And a good way to think about this is like a GPS. GPS needs your destination, your endpoint, but you also need to enter in your starting point. Without your starting point, you can't effectively build that roadmap. Same exact thing here. So over the next couple of days before the next video drops, I need you to, 1, download MyFitnessPal. It's on the App Store, it's free, super easy to set up, and start tracking your food intake with the app. Don't change anything, just eat how you normally eat. And then in the next video, we'll revisit that and determine what that means for you going forward, how that affects your plan going forward, and actually begin to set targets around your calories, your macros, and all that stuff. So like I said, if you enjoyed this video, drop a like on it. And if part 2 is up already, it'll be up on the screen right now. Go ahead and click on that. If not, it will be up in a couple of days, but I appreciate you watching, and I will see you in part 2 of this series.